Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
A little quieter today than it was on Vesak Day, and a little quieter than it was downtown yesterday for the Blues Parade. I'm very grateful to the Master for suggesting the topic of studying the Silk Road and Buddhism, and very thankful to Venerable Kuan Yin for her talk, kind of leading the way into my talk on Buddhism and its contact with the West, or, if you prefer, the West's first contact with Buddhism. So to start off with, when I knew what it was that I wanted to focus on for this talk. It has to do with the philosopher Pyrrho and his relationship to Buddhism. And I had no idea that I was going to run into so much information that needed further investigation. Most of the people who have written about this topic were Greek scholars, even present-day Greek scholars, talking about this relationship of Pyrrho and skepticism to contacts with early Buddhism. So I want to see if I can give a little bit more information from the Buddhist side, not just looking at it from the Greek philosophy side, because I think that there were some mistakes in the scholarship, and I'll explain that as we go along. So this is the Ganges River Basin, and there are 3 points that I want to bring to our attention here. One being in the center area where the Buddha was born in what is now southern Nepal. And then on the lower, I guess your lower left, would be Bodh Gaya and Vulture Peak, etc., that area where much of Buddhist teachings were taking place. And then on the right side, all the way over there, was actually the Kuru country, where the Buddha gives his talk on Satipatthana. I wanted to share a little bit about that. So, looking more closely at these 3 areas, we can see the major rivers coming together, and near where would become one of the 2 capitals of the empire that was ruled over by King Ashoka, Palatapura, and you can see some of the areas in a little bit more detail. So this is the area that was ruled by King Ashoka, the Maurya Empire. As you can see, pretty vast, from 268 to 232 BCE. This is a phenomenally large area. I had no idea when I first started to look at this that King Ashoka had such a vast area that he was involved in. And it had 2 capitals, the one where the Ganges River comes together, and another one called Taxila, which is not far from modern-day Islamabad in Pakistan, what we call that now. Taxila was a very important center for the Silk Road trading that would come along. And there was also an intellectual center. King Ashoka had a chakra. This is a modern rendition, of course, of the original King Ashoka's his logo, we can say. And you'll notice that it has 24 spokes, not 12. 12 for dependent origination, which we know about, and 12 for transcendent origination, which is the teachings that the Buddha gave on how a person exits the cycle of birth and death. And this is in the Upanishad Sutta that is not commonly studied by beginners, but once you become more deeply involved in Buddhist study, you begin to realize that there is not just the 12 steps of dependent origination, but actually 24. And it's impressive that King Ashoka had that kind of knowledge and information. So King Ashoka was a kind of a general who pulled together this entire large empire, but after a very bloody battle at Kalinga, and reviewing the battlefield afterwards, Ashoka realized that he wanted to pledge his life to be non-violent. So in 263 BCE, he dedicated himself to be a Buddhist. And as a result of that, he gave a tremendous amount of resources to the Buddhist community at that time, and built many stupas to house relics of great teachers, and helped the monks, and also was interested in disseminating Buddhism throughout his empire and beyond. So constructing 84,000 stupas. And he sent even his own daughter and son to spread Buddhism in Sri Lanka. That's another story. This is one of the great stupas of Ashoka. So Ashoka also sent Buddhist teachers to Greece. And we'll get into this a little bit more in terms of the early relationship between India and the Greeks. But very interestingly, it turns out that there's evidence that he sent emissaries not only to Greece, but also to what we call Jerusalem area, the Dead Sea. And there was one particular community at the time that was interested in Buddhism called the Qumran community, right on the edge of the Dead Sea, where the Essenes lived. And you may be familiar a little bit about that because of some discussion about the relationship of what happened to Jesus when he disappeared for a significant period of time. Did he go and live with the Essenes? We don't have any information about that. But what we do have is information in the Dead Sea Scrolls that King Ashoka is mentioned. So if King Ashoka is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that means that he was teaching the Greeks about Buddhism. So this may have some explanation. We may never know whether or not Jesus actually came in contact with any of these teachings. It's just a little bit ironic that there are some meaningful coincidences, perhaps, of parallels between the parables that are given by the Buddha and also find its way into Christianity. Most notably, the mustard seed parable, and even more importantly, the parable of the prodigal son, which is almost exactly the same, with some significant variations, because Buddhism and Christianity have a different understanding of karma and grace. But it's just very curious that both of those would find their way into each other's teachings. So we may never have the answer to that, but I found that it was interesting that Ashoka's name was mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the official beginning of the Silk Road isn't until somewhat later. In 207 BCE is usually what they say, the beginning of the Silk Road, because that opens up the Han Dynasty in China. But the Silk Road really had connections to India, and particularly to the area around Taxila, considerably earlier. So this is a map of the Silk Road, and I've highlighted the central area around Taxila for our purposes. So Venerable Kongyen gave a Dharma talk on emphasizing Buddhism in the northwest region of India, which would be what we would call Bactria and Gandhara, but Xuanzang apparently uses the term Kaspera, which is not found in Google. So I had to ask Venerable Kongyen to provide more information about that so we can identify where that was. You know, if it's not in Google, it probably doesn't exist, but apparently it does. So, Gandhara region of ancient India, as you can see at the top here, on your top right, the capital city of that was Taxila. And as you go down, you can see where Sakya is, and that's where, of course, Shakyamuni, this is, he was the, Buddha's father was the king of that particular area. And then further to the south and to the east is Magadha, which is where the Buddha gave quite a bit of his teachings. We believe that Buddha's, probably his native tongue may have been Magadha. Again, there are a number of languages that are spoken in these different areas, but we can see that how many of these locations are rather close to each other, where he was born and where he was raised and where he received his enlightenment, and then much later where the Second Buddhist Council took place, which turns out to be an important piece of the puzzle. So we can see what we're looking at here, borrowing Venerable Kongyen's maps that she used. So now I want to turn our attention back in history to the first contact that we know of between the Buddhists and the Greeks, or for that matter, anyone that we know of from the West. And this main character of our story his name is Pyrrho of Elis. And he lived approximately 360 to 270 BCE, and we wonder, how is it that he made it over to India? Because he's from an area of southwest Greece, and an area that was actually a place where there was a tremendous amount of conflict, lots of wars between Sparta, Persia, and the Athenians. But he was able to extricate himself from that, and eventually he's going to become known as the founder of the school called skepticism in Greece. But we'll go into that a little bit more. So basically, to give you a little heads up of where I'm going, Pyrrho had 3 teachings that he gained from India. He would integrate these 3 teachings from his trip. The first being the 3 Dhamma seals from Buddhism. The second is an attitude of skepticism from a school called the Ajna school. We'll talk about this in a moment. And then a logical reasoning from the Chakukoti, we'll call this the Telerema method of doing logic that is found in one of the original Buddha Suttas. We'll talk a little bit about this as well. You notice that I keep saying we're going to talk about this, so I hope that you don't have any plans for dinner tonight. it is Father's Day, so I wish Happy Father's Day to everyone as well. We'll send a note to your family. How did Pyrrho get to India? Well, he turns out that Alexander the Great was interested in philosophy. He was actually tutored by Aristotle. And when he traveled, he took philosophers with him. And on his great trek across Persia, Babylonia, the Byzantine Empire, etc., he took with him a number of philosophers, including this man named Pyrrho. Here we have a picture of Alexander the Great sitting on his upper chair with Plato teaching him from below. So Pyrrho traveled with Alexander the Great to northwest India, because that was kind of like the furthest east point that Alexander would arrive to in about 325 BCE, after defeating many armies along the way. Pyrrho and Alexander and the rest of his troops arrived very close to the city of Taxila. Pyrrho was 4 years older than Alexander. And what happened here at Taxila is quite interesting, because Alexander had beaten all of these other armies along the way, and he was about to attack Taxila. And the king of Taxila was an intelligent man. He realized that his chances of winning the battle were going to be very low, and it was going to be very costly. So instead of engaging in a big battle, instead he sent carts of gold and silver and jewels with emissaries to Alexander saying, "You're a wonderful guy." And Alexander said, "Oh, well, that's great. I'm not going to attack you. I already have the city, and I have the gold and the silver and everything." He says, "I would like to meet this general, this king." So they met, and actually Alexander was so impressed that he gave some jewels and gold from his sojourn as well, coins that he had received along the way. And they decided to exchange philosophers. So Pyrrho and his teacher went to visit with the philosophers that were in Taxila. And Pyrrho was very impressed by them. They didn't wear a lot of clothing, and so he called them the naked philosophers, the gymnosophists. Gymnos in Greek means naked. They probably were wearing just a scanty robe at that time. And Pyrrho's influence was influenced by these philosophers. So this is again a map showing where Taxila is in this process. And in 326 BCE, this is when Alexander got very close. This is the area that he had controlled all of this area. This is the routes that Alexander the Great took, going over to Egypt and founding the city of Alexandria, where they started a great library, and then traveling throughout this area, all the way through what would be present-day Syria and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, etc., all the way into modern-day Pakistan and to the Indus Valley, where there is the prominent city of Taxila that would sit on the crossroads of the Silk Road, later going both to China and into southern India. So when Alexander reached this edge of Taxila, it was 325, 326 BCE when this took place. So his Pyrrho, accompanied by his teacher, attempted to communicate with Alexander about how impressed they were with the philosophers. Now, Alexander was recovering from a wound from one of the battles, and he was originally not very receptive to wanting to meet with these philosophers. But after particularly Pyrrho's imploring him that these philosophers were great men of wisdom, and Alexander, interested in learning as much as he could about the area, he agreed to meet with them. And so two of the philosophers from the Buddhist side came and met with Alexander. So this is Alexander and King Ambi, who is the king of Taxila. This is so such an important meeting that it actually, we have a photograph. If it's a little blurry, it's because photography wasn't good back then. But, this is an actual painting of this meeting of how the Taxilites were giving tribute to Alexander the Great. So Pyrrho studied this Buddhism and with the philosophers, and Alexander was quite interested in them, and apparently the philosophers at that time were probably giving Pyrrho, we don't know exactly, a kind of a smorgasbord taste of the different philosophies of India. And Buddhism was one, and the jhana view was another, and so that there were probably a number of different views that Pyrrho was exposed to. And so here we even have another painting of Pyrrho talking to the Indian philosophers. Again, these are all painted by people from the Greek tradition. So who is it that Pyrrho actually met? So we don't have exact information about this in terms of, we know the names of the two philosophers that he spoke to, but what their actual school was, what they were actually teaching, we don't know. But there's a pretty good guess that they probably had some significant exposure to the Sarvastivadin school. Because in the Second Council, the Sarvastivadins were displeased with the Orthodox Buddhists who wanted to maintain a certain view and not kind of update things, and the Sarvastivadins split from them and went to Taxila area, the Gandhara, to set up their own school. So that would have been before Pyrrho arrived. So we believe that that's probably the folks that were involved. So the names of the two philosophers, and this took some digging. Dondanus was a name given to one of them, and obviously this is his Greek name. They said that his Indian name was Dondi, but I'm not sure of how accurate that is. And then another one, his name was Calenus, who was, again, given a Greek name. His original name was given as Spinas, but again, that looks a little Greek to me, so it doesn't really, I don't know. We don't really know what their original names were. But we know that Calenus received his name because when he met people, he said to them in his language, greetings, friends. So that's Kalanamita. So he was given that name. So Calenus, we have information about him. We'll use his Greek name here. And We know that he met with Alexander, and Alexander was so impressed by him that he wished for Calenus to become a philosopher in his group. So he would follow Alexander around and advise him and teach him about philosophy. So this was around 323, 324 BCE that this took place. And there are conflicting reports about this. Whether or not Calenus was criticized by his colleague seems to be clear. Calenus did join up with Alexander. And then later there are some people who said, well, Calenus was actually compelled to do it against his will. But we don't really have enough information. But Calenus was aged at this time, and he fell ill, and not too long after, and he decided that he wanted to self-immolate. So they built a funeral pyre for him, and he went and lay down, and they lit it, and he was burned, apparently without making any sound. And Alexander heard about this, and he was quite distraught, but again, quite impressed that this took place. And in fact, again, there is a painting, this one well known by Jean-Baptiste de Champagne, that was painted in 1672, that shows a person coming to Alexander telling him that Calenus had died in this fire. Apparently these stories were quite popular in Greek, and also eventually in Roman, and then in the Renaissance. These stories continued. So others in Alexander's retinue spoke to the Indian philosophers as well. If you want to learn more about that, you can do some of the research. And there were a number of meetings between the Greeks and the Indians during this time, and there was quite a bit of interest into this. Well, one thing I should say is that right before Calenus lay down in the pyre and they lit it, he said, "Please tell Alexander that I will meet him again in Babylon." Ooh. Well, at that point, Alexander had no interest in going to Babylon, but in a few months, Alexander was in Babylon, and that's where he died. I'm not sure, maybe food poisoning, or whether intentional poisoning. There were some revolts from his army that people wanted to go home, so we're not exactly sure what the cause of this was. But in any event, kind of unusual that Calenus seemed to have some understanding of this. So Pyrrho is interpreted by the Greeks as someone who is an agnostic, who takes the Indian philosophy of the gymnosophists and turns it into a philosophy of you can't know anything, ever. And if you try to, we can logically defeat that. But in fact, this is rather a misrepresentation of Pyrrho. If you look at it in more detail, you realize that Pyrrho was trying to integrate a number of different philosophies. Pyrrho himself didn't write anything down, but his student did. And we now know, looking at this in more detail, that Pyrrho was greatly respected when he went back to Greece as a man of great dignity and also of great tranquility, which he said he credited to his study with the Indian philosophers. So even though he's credited as starting the skeptic school, it was based basically on this not having any fixed views, which is somewhat related to Buddhism. his student wrote that you don't hold on to fixed views and opinions. That's what it is that leads beyond suffering. Now, that's somewhat like Buddhism, but not such an extreme as the skeptics take it. We know from the Metta Sutta, for example, by not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, not born again into this world. So this is a very important line from that. And also from another sutta, the Paramattaka Sutta on views, a person who associates himself with certain views, considering them as best and making them supreme in the world, he says, because of that, that is all other views are inferior, therefore he is not freed from contention, gets into lots of arguments. So this was an important part of Buddhism, but not to such an extreme as the skeptics would take it. So many of the people who studied this were, again, Western scholars who were mostly interested in the study of Greek philosophy. And one of them, who's quoted quite a bit, is Christopher Beckwith, and he says something kind of interesting. He says, modern scholars, for example, like these other people, have found close parallels between Pyrrho's skepticism and Buddhist Mid-America thought, with precedents in early Buddhist scriptures. So already we know that there's a mistake here, because Pyrrho was quite a few centuries before the Mid-America. So the three Dharma seals is a starting point that we can understand Pyrrho's philosophy. He comes back with this understanding of all things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without a self. And he translates this into Greek. Now, I have a good Greek friend who was able to go and help me with the pronunciation, which of course I've forgotten, and also the actual definitions. And she said, this is spot on. This is exactly the meaning of those words even today. Anapikrita, anasameta, adiaphora. So these three words, this is what Pyrrho taught. All things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without self. So if you wish, you can go into the resources and you can look at this and see the deeper meaning of these things from the Greek side, but they're very consistent. And Pyrrho was interested in asking questions about how this could be employed in one's daily life and what attitude that we would have toward it and what would be the outcome of using this particular method. He said that these three Dharma seals could be extraordinarily helpful in reducing suffering and aiding a person in attaining tranquility. In addition, Pyrrho probably got confused. He didn't have that much time to study with the Indian philosophers. Remember, Calamus was only with him for a few months before he went to the funeral pyre, and then everybody returned. So there was another school called the Adhyana school. And this school is much closer to skepticism. In skepticism, they say we can never know anything for certain. And the Adhyana school pretty much said the same thing. And this means not knowing. Jhana, in this case, means not knowing. Ajahn. And it was one of the six major schools of philosophy around the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha was well versed in all of these different 6 schools. So the Ajahns held that it was impossible to obtain knowledge of any type, about anything. And Buddha actually had a nickname for these Ajahns. He called them eel wigglers. This is the way that they tried to argue, as an eel wiggler. So you can see these are the different schools. We have one school in India that were amoralists, and another school that were fatalists, and another that were materialists, and another that were eternalists, and another that were restraint-oriented, and another that were agnostic. This is the Ajahns. You can't know anything. And there's a particular sutta where the Buddha takes on all of these 6 schools, and he refutes them in the Brahmajala Sutta, the all-embracing net of views. And in the 6th part, he takes on the Ajahns, and he calls them the eel wigglers. There are those bhikkhus, some recluses and Brahmins, who are endless equivocators, eel wigglers. When they question about this point or that point on 4 grounds, they resort to evasive statements and to endless equivocation. And owing to what, with reference to what, all of these honorable recluses and Brahmins do so. So he goes into this, and if you'd like to read this particular section, it's easily found. So the Ajahns use a method of arguing, and it turns out that the Buddha actually uses a similar argument to dispute them. And this is the first reference that we have to this petrolemma that eventually gets used by Nagarjuna as the foundation of his logical argument system in Mid-America many centuries later. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail because it's rather complex, but basically Pyrrho picked this up and was very impressed by it and brought this method of logical argument back to Greece as well. So in Chinese, Zhou, I believe. Is that okay pronunciation? Okay. So we say the proposition of being is an affirmation, or it's a negation, or it's an affirmation and negation at the same time, or neither an affirmation or negation. So this is the logical argument that is used. If you read Nagarjuna's first verse of the Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, you'll find this method right there in the very first verse. Neither by itself, nor by another, nor by both, nor by neither does anything by itself arise. So as I said, Timon was Pyrrho's scribe. He wrote down much of what Pyrrho had said, and a lot of Timon's philosophy ended up being stored in the Library of Alexandria. So at that time, there were 6 different schools of Hellenistic philosophy. Now this is post-Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. So this is called the Hellenistic period, and these different schools of hedonism, skepticism is one of them. It overlaps somewhat with empirical school. Cynicism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, Neoplatonism, all of these schools were operating during that time. So we see Pyrrho as an important person. He's one of the founders of one of the 6 major schools. And if you have an interest, you can go into more detail, or I can send you my slides outlining the difference between these different schools. Obviously, the hedonists are interested in, they later become known as the Budweiser school. Grab for all the gusto you can, because you only go around once in life. And skepticism, you can't know anything, and cynicism, even more extreme. Nothing matters, really. The Epicureans were pleasure seekers, but for the greatest good. And their pleasure is gotten through study and modesty. But now, of course, Epicureanism has become like a food kind of thing, so the meaning has kind of changed. Again, Stoicism became more extreme in the West than the modern view, but originally it meant control yourself, control your urges, etc. So these are the different schools. Sextus Empiricus is someone who kind of bridges the gap between skepticism and empiricism. Many of these people were physicians. They were looking for ways of being able to help people with illnesses, but again, they had a scientific view saying you really can't know anything for sure. And so Pyrrho, through Sextus Empiricus, has a profound view on modern skepticism. But the thing that is most interesting in my reading was one particular philosopher who said that Pyrrho's view, and particularly his emphasis on gaining tranquility, was a Zen-like point. I like that. And so there are many later Greek teachers who talk about these things. So I just want to mention one more character in the drama, and this is because much of the original works of Pyrrho and Timon, who wrote them down, as I said, were found in Alexandria by a philosopher there. His name was Philo of Alexandria. His actual name was Philo Judaeus. So Philo Judaeus was a Jewish fellow. Being Jewish myself, I identify with him immediately, right? And he's well known for one quote: "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle." So, rather than to keep us here forever, I'm going to just summarize and say that Pyrrho's 3 teachings were the 3 Dharma seals from Buddhism, the skepticism from the Ajahns, and the logical reasoning of the Tetralemma. And we can dedicate the merit together. May the merits of our wholesome deeds reach every part of the world. May sentient beings, large and small, all attain enlightenment, the highest perfection of wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. Well, thank you all for going with me on this journey.